In the bustling heart of Chicago's Union Station, a simple act of kindness is about to change 3 lives forever. Ernesto Alvarez, a weathered 54-year-old single father, tends his modest flower stall each morning before the commuter rush begins. His calloused hands arrange carnations and roses with the same gentle care he shows. His 13-year-old son, Mateo, when an elegant elderly woman hesitates at the station's entrance, her white cane trembling against the December wind, Nesto doesn't think twice about offering his arm. What he doesn't know is that Martha Caldwell's daughter sits watching from a luxury SUV across the street. Celeste Caldwell Reed built a billion-dollar empire by trusting no one, especially with her vulnerable mother's safety. But something about this humble flower vendor's genuine warmth toward Martha stirs memories of the father she lost years ago. Will one moment of unexpected compassion bridge the gap between 2 worlds that seem impossibly far apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through the pre-dawn silence at 4:30, just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Ernesto Alvarez Nesto, to everyone who mattered, rolled from his narrow bed with the practiced quiet of a man who'd learned not to wake a sleeping child. The floorboards of their cramped apartment above Kowalski's Polish bakery creaked familiar protests as he padded to the kitchenette, where yesterday's coffee grounds waited for their second life. Through the frost-etched window, Michigan Avenue stretched empty except for the occasional taxi carrying night shift workers home. In 2 hours, this same street would pulse with the relentless energy of Chicago's morning rush. But for now, it belonged to the early risers and the dreamers. Nesto counted himself among both. The coffee maker gurgled to life as he pulled on. Yesterday's jeans and a sweater Carmen had knitted him during her final winter. The navy blue wool had worn thin at the elbows, but he couldn't bring himself to replace it. Some mornings, when he pressed the fabric to his face, he could still catch the faintest trace of her lavender soap. 13-year-old Mateo lay curled beneath a mountain of second-hand quilts, his dark hair tousled against the pillow, one thin arm draped protectively over his current treasure. Dog-eared copy of Great Expectations he discovered at the Salvation Army store. The boy devoured books the way other kids consumed video games, often reading by flashlight, long after Nesto thought he'd fallen asleep. Last month, Mateo had announced his intention to attend Northwestern University and study literature. The tuition figures Nesto had quietly researched online made his chest tighten with a familiar ache of wanting to give his son the world while knowing his own limitations. "Education is the one thing they can never take from you, Mio," Carmen used to say, her fingers combing through Mateo's baby-fine hair as she read him bedtime stories. "Promise me you'll remember that." It was one of the last coherent things she'd said before the cancer stole her voice. Then her breath, then everything else that mattered. Nesto's work boots made soft scuffing sounds against the linoleum as he gathered his supplies, the worn leather tool belt that had belonged to his father, a thermos of black coffee, and the lunch Mateo had packed for him the night before, 2 peanut butter sandwiches and an apple that had seen better days. The boy worried about him, the way children shouldn't have to worry about their parents. But Nesto had learned to pick his battles. If making his father's lunch helped Mateo feel useful, so be it. The flower stall at Union Station had never been part of any grand plan. 3 years ago, after Carmen's funeral expenses had drained their modest savings and the construction company had laid him off, Nesto had spotted the for lease sign tucked between a coffee cart and a newsstand. The rent was manageable, barely, and flowers struck him as something hopeful in a world that had recently felt drained of color. He'd learned the business through trial and error, developing relationships with wholesale suppliers who appreciated his reliability even when they questioned his unconventional career change. Mrs. Chun at Midtown Flowers had become something of a mentor, teaching him which blooms lasted longest and how to arrange them with an eye for beauty rather than mere function. Flowers are about moments, she'd explained during one of his early fumbling attempts at a wedding bouquet. People don't buy flowers because they need them. They buy them because they want to say something they can't find words for. The lesson had stuck. Nesto approached each arrangement as if it carried someone's unspoken message: love, forgiveness, hope, remembrance. It made the work feel less like selling and more like serving, which suited his nature better than he'd expected. By 6 o'clock, he was pushing his cart through the station's vast main hall, where early commuters moved with the purposeful urgency of people who'd learned to measure their lives in train schedules. The morning light filtered through the enormous windows in shafts of gold and amber, transforming the bustling space into something almost cathedral-like. Nesto had grown to love these quiet moments before the real chaos began, when he could arrange his flowers in peace and watch the city wake up around him. His stall occupied a prime corner spot near the departure boards, where anxious travelers paused to check their connections. Over the months, he developed a sense for which customers wanted conversation along with their purchase, and which preferred to conduct their business in efficient silence. The regulars had become part of his extended family, Mrs. Rodriguez, who bought yellow roses every Friday for her mother's grave. Tom Bradley, the investment banker who purchased a single red carnation each anniversary and never explained why. And Sarah Martinez, the young nurse who stopped by after her night shifts to buy daisies because they reminded her of home. The morning crowd brought its usual mix of coffee-fueled professionals and bleary-eyed students. But around 8:30, Nesto noticed someone new. An elderly woman stood near the main entrance, her posture elegant despite the obvious uncertainty in her movements. She wore a charcoal wool coat that spoke of quality and careful maintenance, and her silver hair was arranged in a style that suggested weekly salon appointments. But it was the white cane in her gloved hand that caught his attention, not because of what it represented, but because of how she held it. Like a reluctant admission rather than a trusted tool, she seemed to be listening to the flow of foot traffic, her head tilted slightly as she tried to navigate the morning rush through sound alone. Commuters streamed past her with the single-minded focus of people running late, their conversations creating a wall of noise that would make it difficult for anyone to find their bearings. Something about her dignity in the face of vulnerability reminded Nesto of his own mother, who had faced her final years with a similar mixture of grace and stubborn independence. He found himself stepping away from his stall, drawn by an instinct that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the simple recognition of need. What he didn't notice was the black SUV idling at the curb outside, its tinted windows concealing the woman who watched every movement with the intensity of a protective mother bird. Celeste Caldwell Reed sat in the leather back seat, her manicured fingers drumming against her knee as she observed her mother's latest attempt at independence. At 60, Celeste had built Caldwell Reed Logistics into a global powerhouse through a combination of inherited capital, ruthless efficiency, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate market trends. Her corner office on the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower commanded views that stretched to 3 states, and her signature appeared on contracts worth millions. But none of that mattered when it came to Martha's safety. The decision to let her mother travel, like ordinary people, had been a compromise born of exhaustion. Martha's increasing insistence on maintaining her independence, despite her advancing age and recent vision loss, had become a source of constant tension between them. The private car and personal aid Martha had tolerated for years were suddenly too much fuss, and she'd begun taking public transportation with a determination that bordered on defiance. "I'm not ready to be warehoused yet, Celeste," Martha had said during their last argument about her travel arrangements. "I've been riding trains longer than you've been alive, and I won't be treated like an invalid just because I can't see the departure board anymore. So Celeste had compromised surveillance from a distance, ready to intervene if necessary, but allowing Martha the illusion of independence she seemed to need. It was an arrangement that satisfied neither of them, but represented the fragile peace they'd managed to maintain since Celeste's father had died 2 years earlier. From her vantage point in the SUV, Celeste watched the flower vendor approach, her mother with something that looked suspiciously like genuine concern. Her first instinct was protective suspicion in her experience. Strangers who offered help usually wanted something in return, and vulnerable elderly women made attractive targets for various kinds of exploitation. But as she observed the interaction, something about the man's manner gave her pause. His approach was respectful, unhurried, and he waited for Martha's permission before offering his arm. There was nothing calculated in his movements, no hint of the practiced charm that Celeste had learned to recognize in people who viewed her mother's obvious affluence as an opportunity. Through the glass, she could see Martha's face relax into a smile, the first genuine smile Celeste had witnessed from her mother in months. The sight stirred something unexpected in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and an emotion she couldn't quite name. When was the last time someone had been simply kind to Martha without knowing who she was or what she represented? The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her mother was lonely. Despite the comfortable home, the attentive staff, and Celeste's dutiful weekly visits, Martha was profoundly, achingly lonely. And this stranger with his worn clothes and gentle manner had managed to light up her face in a way that Celeste's expensive gifts and carefully planned outings never seemed to accomplish. As she watched the flower vendor guide her mother toward the departure board, reading the destinations aloud in a voice that carried clearly across the station's din, Celeste found herself leaning forward in her seat. For the first time in years, she was seeing her mother not as a responsibility or a source of worry, but as a person, a woman who had once been young and adventurous, who had fallen in love and raised a family and built a life rich with experiences that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or board meetings. The man was helping Martha find her train to Graceland Cemetery, where she made monthly pilgrimages to visit Celeste's father's grave. It was a journey Martha had insisted on making alone since the funeral, rejecting all offers of companionship with a fierce independence that Celeste had never quite understood. Now, watching her mother accept help from a stranger while maintaining her dignity, Celeste began to glimpse the difference between assistance and pity, between kindness and condescension. When Martha's train arrived and the flower vendor ensured she was safely aboard before returning to his stall, Celeste remained in the SUV for several more minutes, processing what she'd witnessed. The interaction had lasted less than 10 minutes, but something about it felt significant in a way she couldn't yet articulate. As her driver prepared to follow Martha's train to ensure she reached her destination safely, Celeste found herself taking note of the flower stall's location and the man who ran it. She wasn't sure why, but she had the distinct impression that this morning had marked the beginning of something important, though she couldn't have said what that might be. The SUV pulled away from the curb, joining the stream of traffic heading south toward the cemetery, but Celeste's thoughts remained fixed on the scene she'd just witnessed. For a woman who prided herself on understanding people's motivations, the flower vendor's simple act of kindness presented a puzzle she found herself genuinely wanting to solve. A week passed before Martha returned to Union Station, and Nesto found himself looking for her elegant figure each morning as he arranged his flowers. He told himself it was simple concern, the kind any decent person would feel for someone who'd seemed lost in the chaos of the morning rush. But truthfully, something about her quiet dignity had stayed with him, a reminder of the grace his own grandmother had carried through her final years. When Martha appeared again the following Tuesday, wearing the same charcoal coat, but moving with slightly more confidence, Nesto felt an unexpected lift in his spirits. She paused near the information board, Her white cane extended as she listened to the mechanical announcements echoing through the vaulted space. "The 9:15 to Graceland Cemetery," Nesto called out gently, approaching with the same unhurried manner he'd used the week before. "Track 7, about 50 yards to your left." Martha's face brightened with recognition. "The Flower Man," she said, and her voice carried a warmth that made the formal title sound affectionate. "I was hoping I might encounter you again." "Nesto Alvarez," he said, offering his arm. "And it's my pleasure to help." As they walked toward the platform, Martha's gloved hand resting lightly on his forearm, she spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to make every word count. "I come here once a month to visit my husband. Harold's been gone 2 years now, but I find myself telling him about everything that's happened since our last conversation. Foolish, perhaps, but comforting." "Not foolish at all," Nesto replied, thinking of the conversations he still held with Carmen in the quiet moments before sleep. "My wife passed 3 years ago. Sometimes I catch myself setting 2 coffee cups in the morning, or saving up little stories to tell her when I get home." Martha's step faltered slightly, and she squeezed his arm. "I'm sorry for your loss. 3 years, that's still so fresh. How do you manage?" "One day at a time," Nesto said, the words automatic but no less true for their familiarity. "I have a 13-year-old son, which helps. Hard to stay lost in grief when someone needs breakfast and help with homework." They reached the platform as Martha's train approached, its brakes hissing against the cold morning air. But instead of immediately boarding, Martha turned toward him with a question that seemed to carry more weight than its simple words suggested. "Would you tell me about her? Your wife?" The request caught Nesto off guard. Most people, even well-meaning friends, had learned to avoid the subject of Carmen, as if mentioning her name might somehow deepen his pain. But something in Martha's tone suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "Carmen," he said, and found that speaking her name to this near stranger felt easier than it had in months. "She was a teacher at the elementary school in our neighborhood. Loved kids who were struggling, the ones other people sometimes gave up on. She used to say that every child just needed someone to believe they were capable of extraordinary things." Martha nodded slowly. "She sounds like a woman who understood the importance of seeing people clearly. She had this way of making everyone feel like they mattered," Nesto continued, surprised by how natural the words felt. "Not just students, but checkout clerks and bus drivers, and anyone who crossed her path. She collected people the way some folks collect stamps." The train doors opened with a mechanical chime, but Martha made no move to board. "And now you're raising your son alone." "Mateo. He's 13, loves books more than breathing, and worries about me more than any kid should have to worry about." "His father." Nesto smiled despite the ache in his chest. "Smart as a whip, that one. Wants to go to Northwestern someday and study literature." "Northwestern is an excellent school," Martha said, something shifting in her tone. "Expensive, but excellent." "We'll figure it out," Nesto said with more confidence than he felt. Carmen always said education was the one investment that paid dividends forever. The conductor called for final boarding, and Martha reluctantly turned toward the train. "I should go. Harold doesn't like to be kept waiting, even in death." She paused with one foot on the step. "Thank you, Nesto, not just for the assistance, but for sharing her memory with me. It's been a long time since anyone spoke to me about love in such simple, honest terms." As the train pulled away, Nesto found himself standing on the platform longer than necessary, turning Martha's words over in his mind. There had been something almost hungry in the way she'd listened to his stories about Carmen, as if she'd been starved for genuine emotion in a world of careful politeness. What he didn't know was that Celeste had been watching again from her SUV, this time positioned closer to the platform, where she could observe their interaction more clearly. Through the telephoto lens of her security chief's camera, she'd seen her mother's face during the conversation, animated and engaged in a way that Celeste rarely witnessed anymore. When Martha emerged from the cemetery 3 hours later, Celeste was waiting in the passenger pickup area, having dismissed her driver for a conversation that required privacy. "How was your visit with Dad?" Celeste asked as Martha settled into the leather seat. "Productive," Martha replied, but her tone carried an unusual lightness. "I told him about the kind young man at the train station, the one with the flower stall." Celeste's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "You spoke with him again?" "His name is Nesto Alvarez. He lost his wife 3 years ago and is raising a teenage son alone. Works incredibly hard to make ends meet, from what I could gather." Martha paused, studying her daughter's profile. "He has the sort of decency that's become quite rare in my experience. Mother, you can't just trust every stranger who offers to help you. People see an elderly woman traveling alone and what? Assume I'm an easy mark?" Martha's voice carried an edge that made Celeste wince. "I may be losing my sight, Celeste, but my judgment remains intact. This man expects nothing from me except the chance to be kind. When was the last time you encountered someone like that?" The question hung between them as they drove through the city's afternoon traffic. Celeste prided herself on her ability to read people, to understand their motivations and leverage their desires for mutual benefit. But Martha's description of Nesto Alvarez presented a type of person who didn't fit neatly into her worldview, someone who helped others simply because they needed help. "What did you talk about?" Celeste asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Love," Martha said simply. "He told me about his wife, how she made everyone feel important. I haven't heard anyone speak about love like that in years, without agenda or artifice, just honest grief and genuine fondness." Martha turned toward the window, watching the city pass by with an expression Celeste couldn't quite read. "Your father used to talk about love that way. Before the business consumed everything, before we learned to measure relationships by their strategic value." The criticism stung because it contained too much truth for comfortable dismissal. Celeste's romantic history consisted of a brief marriage to a fellow MBA who treated their relationship like a corporate merger, and a series of subsequent arrangements that prioritized compatibility of schedules over matters of the heart. "Just concerned about your safety," Celeste said. "I know you are, dear, but safety isn't the same as living." Martha reached over and patted her daughter's hand with surprising firmness. "I'm 83 years old. I've buried a husband, raised a daughter, and built a life that most people would consider successful. But I'm not ready to stop experiencing new things just because they might involve a small element of risk." That evening, Celeste sat in her penthouse office reviewing quarterly reports, but her concentration kept drifting to the conversation with her mother. She found herself opening her laptop and typing Nesto Alvarez Chicago into the search engine, then stopping with her finger poised over the enter key. What was she doing? Background checks on strangers who'd shown her mother simple kindness? The thought made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite articulate. But something about the whole situation felt significant, as if her mother's chance encounters with this flower vendor were leading towards something larger than either of them had anticipated. Finally, she closed the laptop without conducting the search. For once in her carefully controlled life, Celeste decided to let events unfold without her intervention or investigation. It was a choice that felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. Meanwhile, across the city in his cramped apartment above the bakery, Nesto sat at the small table helping Matteo with his English homework. The boy was analyzing a passage from Great Expectations, his worn copy of the novel open beside his notebook, its pages marked with careful annotations in his precise handwriting. "What do you think Dickens meant when he wrote about Pitt's Great Expectations?" Nesto asked, though literature had never been his strongest subject. Matteo looked up from his notes, his dark eyes serious, behind wire-rimmed glasses that made him appear older than his 13 years. I think he meant that sometimes the things we think we want aren't the things that actually make us happy. Pip thought money and status would solve everything, but they just made him forget what really mattered. Nesto studied his son's thoughtful expression and felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with worry. Matteo possessed a wisdom that seemed to skip generations, but with it came a solemnity that sometimes concerned his father. At 13, the boy should be playing video games and complaining about chores, not contemplating the deeper meanings of life through Victorian literature. You know what I think? Nesto said, reaching into his wallet and pulling out a small, pressed rose that had been carefully preserved between two pieces of clear tape. It was from Carmen's wedding bouquet, saved all these years as a reminder of the promises they'd made to each other. I think your mother would be proud of how you're turning out. She always said the most important education happened outside of books learning to see people clearly, to be kind without expecting anything in return. Matteo reached out to touch the pressed flower gently. Do you think she would have liked Mrs. Caldwell? The lady you helped at the station? The question surprised Nesto. He'd mentioned his encounter with Martha only briefly, but Matteo had a way of picking up on the details that mattered to his father. I think she would have, Nesto said after considering the question seriously. Your mother had a soft spot for people who carried themselves with dignity, even when life had knocked them around a bit. As they sat together in the warm circle of lamplight, surrounded by the familiar sounds of their neighbors settling in for the evening, neither of them could have imagined how dramatically their quiet lives were about to change. Sometimes the most significant moments begin with the smallest gestures, a helping hand offered without calculation, a story shared between strangers, or a pressed flower kept close to the heart as a reminder that love, once given freely, never truly ends. Celeste's decision to avoid investigating Nesto Alvarez lasted exactly 3 days. By Friday morning, she found herself pacing her corner office while her assistant fielded calls, her mind circling back to the image of her mother's animated face during their conversation about the flower vendor. The maternal protection instinct that had driven her to success in business was now demanding answers about this man who'd somehow earned Martha's trust so easily. She pressed the intercom button with more force than necessary. Rebecca, I need you to run a discreet background check on someone. Of course, Miss Caldwell Reed. What information do you have? Ernesto Alvarez operates a flower stall at Union Station. Widowed, has a teenage son. Celeste paused, feeling slightly ridiculous. Actually, cancel that. I'll handle it myself. But as she reached for her phone to call the private investigation firm the company used for employee screening, her hand stopped mid-motion. In her desk drawer, beneath a stack of quarterly reports, lay a faded business card that had belonged to her father. Harold Caldwell had carried it for 30 years, though the small accounting firm it advertised had closed decades ago. It was the card of the man who'd given Harold his first job out of college, who'd taught him that success meant more than profit margins. Treat people with respect first, Harold, the old accountant had told him. Everything else is just paperwork. Harold had repeated that advice to Celeste countless times during her childhood, though somewhere along the way, between business school and boardroom battles, she'd learned to lead with caution instead of respect. The realization made her uncomfortable. She picked up the business card, running her thumb over the raised lettering that had worn smooth with age. What would her father think of her impulse to investigate a man whose only crime was showing kindness to his widow? The question stung more than she cared to admit. Instead of making the call, Celeste found herself walking to the elevator. 10 minutes later, she stood outside Union Station, studying the morning crowd with the analytical eye she usually reserved for market assessments. The flower stall was exactly where Martha had described it, tucked into a corner spot that caught the morning light streaming through the station's enormous windows. Nesto was arranging white chrysanthemums in a metal bucket, his movements careful and deliberate. Even from a distance, Celeste could see the attention he paid to each stem, the way he adjusted their positions, until the overall effect achieved a natural grace that suggested artistic sensibility rather than mere commercial display. She watched him interact with customers, a businessman who purchased a single red rose with hurried efficiency, an elderly woman who spent several minutes examining different bouquets while Nesta waited patiently, offering gentle suggestions without pressuring her toward a more expensive choice. There was something refreshing about his approach to commerce, a lack of aggressive salesmanship that spoke to genuine confidence in his product. Looking for anything special today? Celeste startled, realizing that while she'd been observing from what she thought was a safe distance, Nesto had noticed her attention and approached with a friendly smile. Up close, she could see the care he took with his appearance, despite his obviously limited resources. His shirt was pressed, his dark hair neatly trimmed, and his work boots, though worn, were clean and well-maintained. "I was just admiring your arrangements," she said, truth being easier than fabrication. "They're quite beautiful. Thank you. I'm still learning, but flowers are forgiving teachers." His accent carried the musical rhythm of someone who'd spoken Spanish as a first language, but had spent decades perfecting his English. "Are you looking for anything particular? A gift, maybe?" Celeste found herself genuinely considering the question. When was the last time she'd purchased flowers for someone? Business gifts were handled by her assistant, and her personal relationships had devolved into the sort of efficient exchanges that rarely called for spontaneous gestures. "Actually, yes. Something for my mother. She's been feeling a bit lonely lately." Nesta's expression shifted to one of gentle understanding. Loneliness is tough at any age, but especially for older folks who've seen a lot of changes. What kind of things does she enjoy? The question caught Celeste off guard. She realized with dismay that she wasn't entirely sure how to answer. Martha's preferences had become filtered through the lens of practicality-safe activities, comfortable transportation, appropriate social interactions. When had she stopped thinking of her mother as a person with desires and interests beyond mere physical well-being? "She likes classical music," Celeste said finally, "and she reads voraciously, though her eyesight has been failing. She's very elegant, traditional in her tastes." Nesto nodded thoughtfully and moved toward a display of pale pink roses mixed with white baby's breath and eucalyptus greenery. "These remind me of the arrangements my grandmother used to make for special occasions. Classic, dignified, but with enough softness to feel warm rather than formal." As he began selecting stems with practiced efficiency, Celeste found herself studying his hands. They were working hands calloused from manual labor, scarred from minor cuts and scrapes, but they moved among the flowers with surprising delicacy. There was something honest about the contradiction that appealed to her despite her usual preference for polished surfaces. "You mentioned she's been lonely," Nesto said, as he wrapped the bouquet in brown paper tied with a simple ribbon. "Sometimes the best gift isn't the flowers themselves, but the time spent sharing them. Maybe she'd enjoy helping you arrange them, or talking about where they came from." The suggestion was so simple, so obvious, that Celeste felt slightly ashamed for not thinking of it herself. When had she started treating her mother like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be enjoyed? "That's a lovely idea," she said, accepting the bouquet and reaching for her wallet. "How much do I owe you?" $25. The price seemed impossibly modest for the quality of the arrangement, and Celeste found herself pulling out 2 20s. "Keep the change. And thank you for the advice about spending time with her." Nesto looked genuinely surprised by the tip, but accepted it with quiet dignity. "I hope she enjoys them. And if you don't mind me saying, loneliness is usually easier to fix than people think. Sometimes it just takes someone making the effort to really see the person underneath the circumstances." As Celeste walked away with the flowers, Nesto's words echoed in her mind with uncomfortable accuracy. When was the last time she'd really seen Martha, rather than simply monitoring her safety and comfort? The realization that a stranger had offered better insight into her mother's emotional needs than she possessed felt like a professional failure of the most personal kind. That evening, instead of her usual brief check-in call, Celeste drove to Martha's Lincoln Park brownstone with the flowers and an uncharacteristic lack of agenda. Martha answered the door wearing a cashmere cardigan and her favorite pearl necklace, the one Harold had given her on their wedding day, and that she still wore whenever she wanted to feel especially elegant. Celeste. What a lovely surprise. Martha's face lit up as she detected the floral fragrance. Are those for me? From a vendor at Union Station, Celeste said, watching her mother's expression carefully. He suggested we arrange them together. Martha's hand stilled as she accepted the bouquet, and something shifted in her posture. The flower vendor? Nesto? You know him? Celeste asked, though Martha's reaction had already answered the question. We've spoken a few times. He helped me find my train. Martha brought the flowers to her face, inhaling deeply. He's a good man. Lost his wife a few years ago, raising a teenage son on his own. They moved to Martha's kitchen, where afternoon light slanted through lace curtains onto a breakfast table that had hosted countless family meals over the years. As they worked together trimming stems and arranging the flowers in Martha's crystal vase, Celeste found herself really looking at her mother for the first time in months. Martha's hands moved among the flowers with muscle memory that spoke of decades of similar arrangements. Her touch was sure despite her failing vision, and she hummed softly as she worked a habit from Celeste's childhood that had somehow been forgotten in the rush of adult responsibilities. He has excellent taste, Martha said, positioning a particularly perfect rose at the center of the arrangement. These are exactly the sort of flowers your father used to bring me when we were courting. Simple, elegant, chosen with thought rather than expense. Tell me about those days, Celeste said impulsively. You and Dad when you were young. Martha's hands stilled, and she turned toward her daughter with an expression of gentle surprise. You want to hear old stories? I realize I don't know nearly enough about who you were before you became my mother. For the next 2 hours, as they finished the arrangement and shared a pot of tea, Martha told stories that painted pictures of a courtship that had unfolded through shared books and long walks of early married years spent building a business and a family with equal devotion. She spoke of Harold not as the successful entrepreneur Celeste remembered, but as a young man who'd written her poetry and learned to dance because it made her happy. The business success came later, Martha said, cradling her teacup with both hands. But the foundation was always love and genuine partnership. We made decisions together, celebrated each other's victories, and never let ambition replace affection. As Celeste drove home through the city's evening traffic, she found herself thinking not about quarterly reports or board meetings, but about the kind of partnership her parents had built, and the realization that she'd never experienced anything similar. Her brief marriage had been more merger than union, and the relationships that followed had been carefully constructed around compatible schedules and mutual professional benefit. For the first time in years, Celeste wondered what she might be missing by approaching life with such calculated precision. The flower vendor's simple suggestion to spend time really seeing her mother had revealed how much she'd been overlooking in her pursuit of efficiency and control. That night, she sat in her penthouse looking out over the city lights and found herself genuinely curious about Nesto Alvarez. Not as a potential threat to be investigated, but as a person who seemed to understand something about human connection that she'd somehow failed to learn despite all her education and professional success. The shift in perspective felt both uncomfortable and oddly hopeful, like the first signs of spring after a winter that had lasted longer than anyone expected. Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call to Nesto's small apartment. He was helping Mateo gather his school books when his ancient flip phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Corporate calls usually meant collection agencies or telemarketers, so he answered with cautious politeness. Mr. Alvarez? This is Rebecca Chun from Caldwell Reed Logistics. Ms. Caldwell Reed would like to discuss a potential business arrangement with you. Would you be available for a meeting this afternoon? Nesto nearly dropped the phone. Caldwell Reed was the kind of company whose name appeared on billboards and business section headlines, exactly the sort of corporate giant that had no reason to know a flower vendor existed, let alone want to meet with one. I'm sorry, I think there might be some mistake, he said. I run a small flower stall. I can't imagine what business I'd have with a logistics company. No mistake, sir. Miss Caldwell Reed specifically requested this meeting. Would 2 o'clock work for you? After getting the address and hanging up, Nesto stood staring at the phone as if it might offer additional explanation. Matteo looked up from his backpack with the sort of curiosity that made him such a good student. Who was that, Dad? Someone from a big company wants to meet with me. I have no idea why. Maybe they want to buy flowers for their offices, Matteo suggested with the practical optimism that had carried him through life's various challenges. Rich people need flowers too, right? The Willis Tower's 42nd floor felt like another planet to someone accustomed to the friendly chaos of Union Station. Nesto's reflection in the elevator's polished steel seemed foreign. Working man in his only decent slacks and the button-down shirt he saved for parent-teacher conferences, carrying a small sample arrangement in a mason jar because he wasn't sure what else to bring to a business meeting. Rebecca Chun met him in the reception area, a efficient young woman who managed to be both professional and genuinely welcoming. Mr. Alvarez? Miss Caldwell Reed is looking forward to meeting you. Can I offer you coffee or water? The corner office commanded views that stretched to the horizon, but what struck Nesto most was how impersonal it felt. Despite obviously expensive furniture and artwork, the space could have belonged to anyone. There were no family photos, no personal touches that might hint at the interests or personality of its occupant. Celeste rose from behind her desk as he entered, and Nesto recognized her immediately as the woman who'd purchased flowers for her mother. She was younger than he'd expected for someone in such a position of authority, perhaps in her late 50s, with silver threading through dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested both competence and control. Mr. Alvarez, thank you for coming. Please have a seat. She gestured to a seating area with leather chairs arranged around a glass coffee table. I should probably explain how I know who you are. I was wondering about that, Nesto admitted, settling into a chair that probably cost more than he made. In a month, you helped my mother, Martha Caldwell, at Union Station. She's spoken about you quite warmly, and I wanted to meet the person who's been so kind to her. The pieces clicked into place with surprising force. Nesto had wondered about Martha's obvious affluence, but he'd never imagined she might be connected to one of Chicago's most prominent business families. The realization made him slightly uncomfortable, not because wealth intimidated him, but because it suggested his interactions with Martha might have been observed and analyzed in ways he'd never intended. Your mother is a lovely lady, he said, carefully. I was just helping her find her train. I know. And that's exactly why I wanted to talk with you. Celeste leaned forward slightly, her expression more earnest than he'd expected from someone in her position. I've been thinking about expanding our corporate culture to include more community engagement. One idea is to source our floral arrangements locally from small business owners who share our values. Nesto's eyebrows rose. You want to buy flowers from me? Weekly arrangements for our reception areas, executive conference rooms, and employee break rooms. It would be a significant contract, probably enough to triple your current revenue. The offer was so unexpected, so far beyond anything Nesto had imagined when he'd started his small business, that he found himself temporarily speechless. His mind raced through calculations Matteo's college fund, their cramped apartment, the constant worry about making rent and keeping food on the table. "That's incredibly generous," he said finally. "But I have to ask, is this really about community engagement? Or is it something else?" Celeste's composed expression flickered with what might have been surprise or respect. "You're very direct. I've learned it saves time in the long run." She was quiet for a moment, studying him with the sort of attention he imagined she usually reserved for important business decisions. "You're right to question my motives. Part of this is about my mother. She's been lonely since my father died, and you've managed to brighten her spirits in a way that I haven't been able to accomplish. I'm grateful for that. And the other part? Honestly, I'm curious about you. You've shown my mother genuine kindness without knowing anything about her circumstances. In my experience, that's rare enough to be valuable." Nesto appreciated her honesty, even if it left him feeling slightly like a specimen under examination. "Ms. Caldwell Reed, I'm flattered by the offer, but I need you to understand something. I helped your mother because she needed help, not because. I was looking for business opportunities. If you're offering me this contract as some kind of payment for being decent to her, it makes me uncomfortable. And if I told you the offer is completely separate, that we genuinely need a local floral supplier and your work is good enough to meet our standards? Is it? I don't know yet. That's why I'd like to start with a trial arrangement. 1 month, weekly deliveries, and we'll see how it works for both of us." The proposal seemed reasonable, though Nesto still felt like he was missing pieces of a larger puzzle. What exactly would you need? For the next 30 minutes, they discussed logistics, delivery schedules, arrangement sizes, seasonal preferences. Celeste's questions were thorough but fair, and Nesto found himself relaxing as the conversation shifted from personal territory to practical business concerns. By the time they'd worked out the basic terms, he was beginning to believe that the offer might be legitimate rather than elaborate charity. "There's one more thing," Celeste said as they wrapped up. "My mother would probably enjoy seeing the arrangements being delivered. Would you mind if she occasionally accompanied you? I know it's unusual, but she doesn't get out as much as she used to." The request confirmed Nesto's suspicion that this business arrangement was at least partially motivated by concern for Martha's well-being. But he found he didn't mind if spending time with his cheerful flower vendor made an elderly woman happy. It seemed like a reasonable fringe benefit. "I'd be glad to have the company," he said. "Your mother is good conversation." As Nesto left, the building with a signed contract in his jacket pocket, he felt simultaneously elated and bewildered. The financial security the arrangement represented would change everything for him and Matteo college savings. A larger apartment, maybe even a small expansion of his business. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just become part of something more complex than a simple vendor relationship. That evening, he sat at their small kitchen table with Matteo, reviewing the contract terms and trying to explain the day's unexpected developments. Matteo listened with the serious attention he brought to everything important, asking thoughtful questions about delivery schedules and payment terms. "Do you think Mrs. Caldwell knows about this?" Matteo asked, running his finger along the contract's elegant letterhead. "I suspect she does," Nesto replied, "though I'm not sure she knows all the details." "Are you worried about working for rich people?" The question was perceptive in the way that often surprised Nesto about his son. "Not worried, exactly, but I want to make sure we remember who we are, even if our circumstances change. Money can make life easier, but it can also complicate things if you're not careful." Matteo nodded soberly. "Mom used to say that a person's character shows most clearly when they have choices." She was right about that, Nesto agreed, thinking about Carmen's wisdom and how it seemed to live on in their son's observations. "I guess we're about to find out what kind of choices we make." 3 days later, Nesto arrived at Caldwell Reed's headquarters with his first delivery elegant arrangements of white lily and greenery that he'd spent extra hours perfecting. Martha had indeed accompanied him, riding in the passenger seat of his old pickup truck with obvious delight at the adventure. "I haven't been to Celeste's office in months," she confided as they navigated downtown traffic. "She always insists on meeting me at restaurants or my house. Says the office is too busy, too stressful for social visits." The comment offered insight into the relationship between mother and daughter that Nesto found somewhat sad. In his experience, family connections required regular tending. Like flowers, they thrived on attention and withered without it. When they arrived at the building, Martha's presence transformed what might have been a routine delivery into something approaching a social event. Employees who clearly knew and respected her stopped to chat, and Nesto watched with interest as a different side of Celeste emerged, warmer, more relaxed, genuinely happy to see her mother in her professional environment. "The arrangements are beautiful," Celeste said as they placed the final bouquet in the executive conference room. "You've exceeded my expectations." "Thank you. Your mother actually suggested the lily and eucalyptus combination. She has an excellent eye for this sort of thing." Martha beamed at the compliment, and Nesto noticed how the praise seemed to straighten her shoulders and brighten her expression. When had someone last valued her opinions or asked for her advice? The realization that such a successful, accomplished woman might feel useless or overlooked struck him as both tragic and fixable dot as they prepared to leave. Martha surprised both him and Celeste by suggesting they stop for coffee at a small cafe she remembered from the neighborhood. What followed was an hour of conversation that meandered through topics ranging from literature to travel to the challenges of running a small business in an increasingly corporate world. Watching Martha and Celeste interact, Nesto began to understand some of the dynamics that had led to this elaborate arrangement. Celeste clearly loved her mother, but seemed uncertain how to bridge the gap between their different worlds. Martha possessed wisdom and experience that her daughter might benefit from, but their interactions had become filtered through concerns about safety and appropriate activities rather than genuine connection. Perhaps, Nesto thought as he drove them back toward Martha's house, the flower delivery arrangement might serve purposes that went beyond simple commerce. Sometimes the most important business conducted had nothing to do with contracts or payment schedules, and everything to do with creating opportunities for the relationships that actually mattered. As Martha's pearl necklace caught the afternoon light streaming through the truck's window, she smiled with the contentment of someone who'd spent time feeling useful and appreciated. It was a small victory, but Nesto had learned to value small victories. They were often the foundation upon which larger transformations were built. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Martha had become Nesto's unofficial business partner. She rode along for every delivery, offering suggestions about seasonal flowers and color combinations that invariably improved his arrangements. More importantly, she'd taken a particular interest in Matteo, often bringing books she thought he might enjoy and engaging him in conversations about literature that left the boy glowing with intellectual excitement. "Your grandmother would have loved him," Nesto told Martha one afternoon as they arranged chrysanthemums in the Caldwell Reed break room. Matteo was at school, but Martha had been asking about his latest reading project. She always said the measure of a person's intelligence wasn't what they knew, but how curious they remained about what they didn't know. Martha smiled as she adjusted a particularly stubborn stem. "Matteo reminds me of myself at that age always. 3 books ahead of what I was supposed to be reading, always asking questions that made adults uncomfortable." She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "I've been thinking about getting him something special. Does he play chess? I taught him the basics, but we only have that old magnetic set with half the pieces missing." Nesto studied Martha's face, recognizing the expression she wore when planning something that would probably be far too generous. "Why do you ask?" "Chess teaches strategic thinking, patience, the ability to see consequences several moves ahead. Those are skills that will serve him well in whatever field he chooses. Martha's tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions about education and development. Besides, I have my late husband's chess set gathering dust. Harold was quite good, taught me to play during our courtship, though I never developed his level of skill. The following Saturday, Martha arrived at their apartment carrying a mahogany box that was clearly an heirloom. When she opened it, Nesto felt his breath catch. The chess pieces were hand-carved, each one a small work of art that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when such things were made to last generations. Matteo's eyes widened as he examined the elegant knights and bishops. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is too much. I can't accept something this valuable." "Nonsense," Martha said briskly, though her tone was warm. "What's the point of beautiful things if they're not being used and appreciated? Besides, I have a selfish motive. I want someone to play with who might actually challenge me." What followed was an afternoon that transformed their small apartment into something resembling a salon from another era. Martha and Matteo bent over the chessboard while Nesto prepared coffee and listened to their conversation, which ranged from opening strategies to the historical context of various famous matches. Martha's teaching style was patient but demanding, pushing Matteo to think several moves ahead while explaining the reasoning behind each principle. "Chess is like life," she told him as they reset the board for a third game. "You can't control what your opponent does, but you can control how you respond. The players who survive and thrive are those who adapt their strategy while staying true to their fundamental principles." Celeste arrived unexpectedly around 4 o'clock, having come to check on her mother after Martha hadn't answered her phone. She stood in the doorway of the small living room, taking in the scene, her elegant mother sitting cross-legged on a second-hand sofa, completely absorbed in explaining chess notation to a 13-year-old boy who hung on her every word. "Don't mind me," Celeste said quietly, settling into the armchair Nesto offered. "I haven't seen Mother this animated about anything in months." For the next hour, Celeste observed a side of her mother she'd almost forgotten existed. Martha the teacher, Martha the mentor, Martha the woman who could inspire intellectual curiosity and make learning feel like adventure rather than obligation. It was the version of her mother that Celeste remembered from her own childhood before grief and age had narrowed Martha's world to the carefully controlled boundaries of safety and routine. "Your move, Mrs. Caldwell," Matteo said, studying the board with the intense concentration he usually reserved for particularly challenging novels. "Take your time to see all your options," Martha advised. "The best move isn't always the most obvious one." As Matteo deliberated, Martha turned to Celeste with an expression that mixed affection and gentle reproach. "You know, you were about his age when you stopped wanting to play chess with me. Too busy with friends and school activities, you said." "I remember," Celeste replied softly. "I also remember you being disappointed, though you tried to hide it." "Not disappointed in you, dear. Disappointed that I was losing my chess partner." Martha reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Though I suppose that's the natural order of things. Children grow up and find their own interests, their own people to challenge them." The comment carried layers of meaning that Celeste was only beginning to understand. How many activities had they shared when she was young? How many traditions had quietly disappeared as she'd grown more independent and eventually moved into her own world of business and adult responsibilities? "I could learn to play again," Celeste said impulsively, "if you'd be willing to teach me." Martha's face lit up with a joy so pure it made Celeste's chest ache. "Really? You'd want to?" "I think I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed our time together. Work has a way of consuming everything if you let it." Nesto, who'd been quietly cleaning up their coffee cups, paused to watch the exchange between mother and daughter. There was something deeply moving about witnessing the moment, when people realized they'd been missing opportunities for connection. That had been available all along. "We could have a tournament," Matteo suggested with a sort of enthusiasm that made him seem younger than his years. Mrs. Caldwell could teach Miss Caldwell Reed, and then we could all play each other. I like that idea, Martha said. Though I should warn you, Celeste, this young man is going to be formidable competition before long. He has the kind of mind that sees patterns others miss. As the afternoon wound down and Celeste prepared to drive her mother home, Martha lingered in the apartment's small entryway, clearly reluctant to end the visit. "Thank you for sharing your afternoon with an old woman," she said to Nestor. "I haven't felt this useful in a very long time." "Thank you for sharing your wisdom with my son," Nestor replied. "And for the record, you're not old, you're experienced." "There's a difference." Martha laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise her with its genuine delight. "You're quite the diplomat, Mr. Alvarez. I can see why Mateo has turned out so well." After they left, Nestor and Mateo cleaned up the apartment while discussing the day's chess lessons. Mateo was clearly excited about having a skilled teacher, but there was something else in his expression, a kind of wondering, gratitude that someone of Martha's obvious refinement and intelligence would take such interest in his development. "Dad," Mateo said as they reset the chess pieces in their new board, "do you think Mrs. Caldwell is lonely?" The question was perceptive in a way that reminded Nestor how observant his son could be about emotional undercurrents that adults sometimes missed. "I think she's been lonely for a while," Nestor said carefully. "Sometimes when people lose someone they love, they forget how to connect with the people who are still there. Like how you were after Mom died." Nestor paused in arranging the chess pieces, struck by the parallel he hadn't quite seen before. "Yeah, something like that. Though I had you to keep me anchored to the world. Mrs. Caldwell's daughter loves her very much, but they've forgotten how to just enjoy each other's company." "Maybe the chess will help," Mateo said with the sort of optimism that made him such good company despite life's various challenges. "Maybe it will," Nestor agreed, thinking about the expression on Celeste's face as she'd watched her mother teach surprised recognition, as if she was remembering something important she'd thought was lost forever. That evening, as Mateo worked on homework at the kitchen table and Nestor prepared their simple dinner, he found himself reflecting on the afternoon's developments. Somehow, their small apartment had become a gathering place for relationships that were rebuilding themselves, a neutral ground where people could rediscover connections that had been strained by time and circumstance. The chess set, with its carefully carved pieces and rich history, seemed to represent something larger than a game. It was a bridge between generations, a tool for teaching patience and strategy, and most importantly, an excuse for people to spend unhurried time together in an age when such opportunities had become increasingly rare. As he watched Mateo carefully studying his algebra homework with the same concentration he'd brought to the chessboard, Nestor felt a familiar surge of gratitude mixed with determination. Whatever complicated dynamics surrounded their growing relationship with the Caldwell family, at its heart was something simple and good people caring about each other's well-being and taking joy in each other's growth and happiness. Sometimes, the most meaningful gifts were not things at all, but opportunities to feel valued, useful, and connected to something larger than oneself. Martha's chess set was beautiful, but her willingness to share her knowledge and enthusiasm was the real, present one that would keep giving long after the games were finished and the pieces were put away. November brought an unexpected invitation that left Nestor staring at the elegant cardstock in his hands, unsure whether to feel honored or terrified. Celeste had called personally to invite him and Mateo to Thanksgiving dinner at her Lincoln Park mansion, mentioning that Martha had been asking about their holiday plans with a sort of persistent interest that suggested the invitation wasn't entirely Celeste's idea. "It'll just be the four of us," Celeste had assured him over the phone. "Nothing formal or complicated. Mother has been talking about cooking a real Thanksgiving dinner for weeks, and I think she'd be disappointed if she didn't have proper guests to cook for." Mateo's reaction to the invitation was a mixture of excitement and anxiety that mirrored his father's feelings. "Do you think we'll fit in?" he asked as they stood in their small bathroom mirror, Nesto helping him knot the tie they'd purchased. "For the occasion. We'll be ourselves," Nesto replied, adjusting his son's collar with hands that were steadier than he felt. "If that's not good enough, then we don't belong there anyway." The Caldwell house was a restored Victorian that managed to feel both grand and welcoming, its bay windows glowing warmly against the early evening darkness. Martha answered the door herself, wearing a burgundy dress that brought out the silver in her hair and an apron that suggested she'd been genuinely involved in meal preparation. "You came," she said, embracing them both with enthusiasm that made Nesto's lingering nervousness begin to fade. "Perfect timing. I was just about to panic about the turkey." The interior of the house reflected the same combination of elegance and comfort as Martha herself antique furniture that invited sitting rather than mere admiration. Bookshelves filled with volumes that showed signs of actual reading, and family photographs spanning decades of holidays and celebrations. What struck Nesto most was how lived-in everything felt, as if the house had been designed for gathering and conversation rather than display. Celeste emerged from the kitchen, wearing jeans and a cashmere sweater, her usual composed businesswoman persona replaced by something more relaxed and approachable. "Fair warning," she said, accepting the bottle of wine Nesto had brought. "Mother has been cooking since yesterday and refuses to accept help. I've been relegated to setting the table and staying out of her way." "Cooking is therapeutic," Martha called from the kitchen, where sounds of active food preparation provided a cheerful soundtrack. "Besides, it's been months since I had an excuse to make a proper feast." The dining room table was set with china that probably qualified as heirloom quality, but the atmosphere was far from stuffy. Martha had insisted on using her good dishes for the occasion, explaining that special occasions were exactly what good dishes were for. A faded family photograph sat in the center of the table, a much younger Martha and Harold with a teenage Celeste, all of them laughing at something beyond the camera's view. "That was taken during our last family Thanksgiving," Celeste said, noticing Mateo's interest in the photograph. "Dad had just told one of his terrible jokes. Mother always laughed at them, even when they weren't funny." "Especially when they weren't funny," Martha corrected, appearing with a platter that made Mateo's eyes widen. "Harold's jokes were so bad they became endearing. I miss them terribly." Dinner conversation flowed with surprising ease, moving from Mateo's recent chess victories to Martha's stories about Thanksgiving traditions from her childhood, when extended family gatherings required multiple tables and military-level coordination. Celeste contributed observations about her business travels, describing holiday celebrations she'd witnessed in different countries with the sort of detail that suggested genuine interest rather than mere professional obligation. "The loneliest Thanksgiving I ever spent was in a 5-star hotel in Singapore," she said, refilling their wine glasses. "Perfect service, excellent food, and absolutely no warmth or connection. I remember calling Dad from my room afterward, feeling more homesick than I had since college." "You never told me that," Martha said softly. "I didn't want you to worry about me being lonely. You and Dad had enough on your plates without adding my emotional state to your concerns." The admission hung in the air for a moment, highlighting the ways family members sometimes protected each other through silence that ultimately created more distance than comfort. Nesto found himself thinking about his own tendency to shield Mateo from adult worries, wondering what important conversations they might have avoided in the name of protection. "Loneliness is something we all experience," Martha said finally. "Sharing it doesn't make us burdens, it makes us human." As they cleared the table together, Nesto noticed the easy rhythm Martha and Celeste had developed despite their earlier tension. They moved around each other in the kitchen with practiced efficiency, and their conversation carried the sort of gentle teasing that spoke of deep familiarity and affection. "Mother always insists on washing the good china by hand," Celeste explained. as they stacked plates carefully beside the sink. She says the dishwasher is too harsh for pieces that have sentimental value. Each plate has history, Martha said, running warm soapy water over a serving dish that had probably graced holiday tables for decades. Your great-grandmother's wedding china, purchased with money she saved from her job at the department store. It feels disrespectful to treat such things carelessly. Matteo listened to these stories with the sort of attention he usually reserved for his favorite books, clearly fascinated by the idea that everyday objects could carry family history. Nesto realized that their own modest possessions, Carmen's recipes, his father's tools, his grandmother's quilt represented similar threads of continuity, even if they lacked the monetary value of heirloom china. After dinner, they retired to the living room, where Martha had built a fire that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Celeste produced a bottle of brandy that had been Harold's favorite, and they settled into comfortable chairs with the sort of contentment that comes from good food in better company. "Tell us about your father," Matteo said to Celeste, his natural curiosity overcoming any shyness about asking personal questions. Celeste smiled, swirling the brandy in her glass as she considered the question. He was the sort of man who remembered everyone's birthday, who could fix anything that broke, and who never met a stranger. Mother used to joke that he could carry on a conversation with a brick wall and somehow make the wall feel interesting. He taught Celeste to drive in the empty parking lot behind his office building, Martha added. Spent entire Saturdays letting her practice parallel parking until she got it perfect, even though she must have curbed the wheels a dozen times. More than a dozen, Celeste laughed. But he never lost patience, never made me feel stupid for struggling with something that seemed so simple to everyone else. The stories that followed painted a picture of Harold Caldwell as a man who'd balanced business success with genuine devotion to his family, who'd managed to build a fortune without losing sight of what actually mattered. Nesto found himself thinking about the kind of father he wanted to be to Matteo, the sort of man who could provide security without sacrificing presence. "What about your parents?" Martha asked Nesto as the conversation naturally shifted. "Matteo has mentioned his grandparents a few times. My father was a carpenter, came here from Mexico when he was 20 with nothing but a tool belt and determination to build something better for his family." Nesto settled back in his chair, remembering. "My mother cleaned houses during the day and took in sewing at night. They worked harder than anyone should have to work, but they never complained about it." "They sound like remarkable people," Celeste said. They were. They died within 6 months of each other about 10 years ago. I think my mother just couldn't imagine life without him. Nesto paused, struck by the parallel to Martha's own recent loss. "They taught me that dignity comes from how you treat people, not from what you own or where you live." "Carmen would have liked them," Matteo said quietly. "She always said the best people were the ones who worked hard and stayed kind." The mention of Carmen brought a moment of respectful silence, broken when Martha reached over to squeeze Nesto's hand. "She sounds like a woman who understood what really matters." "She did," Nesto agreed. "Sometimes I think she's still teaching us through the things she taught Matteo before she died." As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave, Martha insisted on sending them home with enough leftovers to last a week. She packed everything into containers with a sort of maternal efficiency that made it clear this was as much about caring as it was about avoiding waste. "Thank you for sharing your holiday with us," Nesto said as they gathered their coats. "This meant more than you probably realize." "It meant more to me than you realize," Martha replied, embracing them both. "I haven't felt this much like a hostess-like myself in longer than I care to admit." On the drive home through the quiet city streets, Matteo was unusually reflective. "Dad, do you think Mrs. Caldwell and Miss Caldwell Reed are learning how to be family again?" The question was insightful, in a way that reminded Nesto how carefully his son observed the emotional dynamics around him. "I think they're remembering how to enjoy each other's company," Sometimes families need practice, especially after they've been through difficult times, like we did after Mom died. Exactly like that. Grief has a way of making people forget how to connect, even with people they love very much. As they climbed the stairs to their small apartment, Nesto reflected on the evening's unexpected gifts. The food had been excellent, the house beautiful, and the company warm and welcoming. But what struck him most was the realization that they'd been needed, not just as guests, but as catalysts for conversations and connections that might not have happened otherwise. Sometimes families needed the perspective of outsiders to remember what they had to be grateful for, to see their relationships with fresh eyes, and appreciate the bonds that had survived time and loss and the various challenges that life inevitably brought. Tonight had been one of those rare occasions when everyone involved had given and received something valuable, when hospitality had created the space for healing and renewal to quietly take root. The first week of December brought news that shattered the comfortable routine they'd all grown to treasure. Nesto was arranging the weekly delivery at Caldwell Reed when Martha's lawyer, Edward Morrison, arrived unannounced with documents that would change everything they thought they understood about their relationships. Morrison was the sort of man who wore expensive suits like armor and spoke in the careful language of someone accustomed to delivering life-altering information. He found them in the executive conference room, where Martha was helping Nesto position a particularly elaborate arrangement of winter roses and evergreen branches. "Mrs. Caldwell, I apologize for the interruption, but we need to discuss your estate planning revisions. There have been some significant developments that require immediate attention." Martha's face went pale, and she reached instinctively for Nesto's arm to steady herself. "What kind of developments, Edward?" "Perhaps we should speak privately," Morrison suggested, glancing meaningfully at Nesto. "Nonsense. Mr. Alvarez is a friend. Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of him." Morrison opened his briefcase with a sort of deliberate care that suggested he was buying time to choose his words carefully. "Mrs. Caldwell, the private investigator you hired to monitor Miss Caldwell Reed's personal relationships has filed his final report. The results are not what you expected." Nesto felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of Morrison's words sank in. "Private investigator? What are you talking about?" Martha's composure crumbled, and she sank into one of the conference room chairs with a defeated expression that made her look every one of her 83 years. "Oh, my dear boy, this is not how you were supposed to find out." "Find out what?" Nesto's voice was carefully controlled, but Celeste, who had just entered the room, immediately sensed the tension. "What's going on here?" she demanded, taking in the scene her mother's distressed expression, Morrison's grim professionalism, and Nesto's obvious confusion. Morrison cleared his throat and pulled out a thick folder. "Mrs. Caldwell engaged my services 6 months ago to conduct surveillance on both you, Miss Caldwell Reed, and subsequently on Mr. Alvarez. The goal was to determine whether you are capable of forming genuine personal relationships outside of business contexts." "You hired someone to spy on me?" Celeste's voice rose to a level that suggested genuine shock rather than mere anger. "Not spy, dear. Observe. I was concerned about your emotional isolation, your inability to connect with people in meaningful ways. Your father's death left me worried that you were becoming as lonely and disconnected as I was. But unlike me, you seemed determined to deny that loneliness existed." Nesto's mind raced as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed began falling into place. The meetings at Union Station. "You weren't lost at all." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I was lost, just not in the way you thought. I was lost in grief and worry about my daughter's future. When I noticed you helping other travelers, when I saw the kindness you showed to strangers, I thought perhaps you might be exactly what Celeste needed to remember how to trust people again. So you manipulated me into helping you, and then you manipulated your daughter into hiring me." Nesto's voice was quiet, but the hurt in it was unmistakable. This whole thing, the flower contract, the dinners, the friendship, it was all an elaborate test. Not all of it, Martha said desperately. The friendship is real, Nesto. My affection for you and Matteo is genuine. But yes, I arranged the initial meetings because I hoped you might become friends, might teach each other something about trust and connection. Celeste had been listening to this exchange with growing horror. Mother, are you telling me that you orchestrated our entire relationship? That you've been pulling strings behind the scenes, like some kind of emotional puppet master? Morrison consulted his documents with professional detachment. The investigation confirms that both of you have developed genuine feelings for each other, which Mrs. Caldwell viewed as a positive outcome. However, there's more you need to know about the estate planning implications. What estate planning implications? Celeste demanded. Your mother revised her will 6 months ago. The current version leaves the majority of her estate to charity, unless you can demonstrate, by her 84th birthday, that you've learned to maintain meaningful personal relationships based on mutual affection rather than business advantage. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Nesto felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet, leaving him suspended in a reality that no longer made sense. Everything he'd believed about their growing friendships, about Celeste's interest in him, about Martha's genuine affection for Matteo, all of it was suddenly suspect. How much of this did you know? He asked Celeste, though her shocked expression had already answered the question. None of it. I swear to you, Nesto, I had no idea my mother was manipulating the situation. Celeste turned to Martha with an expression that mixed hurt and betrayal. How could you do this? How could you treat people like chess pieces in some elaborate game? Because I was terrified of dying and leaving you alone and bitter, the way I've been since your father passed. Martha's voice broke completely. Because I watched you shut down emotionally after his death, and I knew that if something didn't change, you'd spend the rest of your life in that sterile office, achieving professional success while missing everything that actually matters. So you decided to fix me without my knowledge or consent. I decided to give you an opportunity to fix yourself. And it was working, Celeste. You've been happier these past few months than I've seen you in years. You've been connecting with people, letting your guard down, remembering how to care about something beyond quarterly reports. Nesto stood up abruptly, his face a mask of controlled fury. And what about me, Mrs. Caldwell? What about my feelings, my son's feelings? Did it occur to you that we might get hurt when the truth came out? I hoped the truth would never need to come out. I hoped that by now your relationships would be strong enough to survive the revelation of how they began. You hoped wrong, Nesto said, his voice carrying a finality that made Martha flinch. I thought you were a lonely old woman who needed kindness. I thought your daughter was someone who'd lost her way after her father died. I never imagined I was being evaluated like a job candidate or manipulated into performing emotional labor for your family's psychological rehabilitation. Morrison cleared his throat again. There are legal deadlines involved here. Mrs. Caldwell's 84th birthday is in 6 weeks. If the current will stands, the charitable bequests will proceed as planned. Let them, Celeste said flatly. I don't want money that comes with conditions about my personal life. I don't want anything that requires me to prove my emotional development to lawyers and private investigators. Celeste, please, Martha began. No, Mother, you've done enough. Celeste gathered her purse and coat with sharp, efficient movements. Mr. Alvarez, I'm terminating our business arrangement, effective immediately. The contract clearly states that either party can withdraw with 30 days' notice, and I'm invoking that clause. Celeste, don't punish him for my mistakes, Martha pleaded. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm removing myself from a situation that was fundamentally dishonest from the beginning. Celeste paused at the conference room door. Morrison, please arrange for Mother's transportation home. I need some time to process what I've learned today. After Celeste left, Nesto and Martha sat in painful silence while Morrison packed his documents and made arrangements for Martha's ride. When they were finally alone, Martha reached for Nesto's hand, but he pulled away. "I trusted you," he said quietly. "Worse than that, I let my son trust you. Matteo thinks you care about him, thinks your interest in his education and his future is genuine. How do I explain to a 13-year-old that the woman he's come to see as a grandmother has been treating him like a test subject? My feelings for Matteo are completely genuine," Martha said desperately. "Nothing about that relationship was calculated or false. I love that boy as if he were my own grandson. But you were willing to risk hurting him to manipulate your daughter's emotional life. You were willing to use our friendship as a tool to achieve your own goals, regardless of what it might cost us. I never intended for anyone to be hurt. Intentions don't matter, Mrs. Caldwell. Results matter. And the result is that I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if Celeste's feelings for me are genuine or just a response to your manipulation. I don't know if our friendship means anything to you beyond its utility in your family drama." Nesto gathered his tools and the few remaining flowers, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone trying to maintain composure through sheer force of will. "I'll finish out the week with the remaining deliveries, and then we're done. All of us." As he prepared to leave, Martha made one final attempt. "Nesto, please don't let my mistakes destroy what you and Celeste have built together. Whatever my motivations were in the beginning, what's developed between you is real." "How can it be real when it was built on lies?" Nesto asked. "How can any relationship survive when it starts with deception and manipulation? The same way flowers grow in soil that's been fertilized with things that aren't beautiful," Martha said desperately. "Sometimes beauty emerges from messy beginnings. Flowers don't have feelings, Mrs. Caldwell. They don't feel betrayed when they discover their soil wasn't what they thought it was." Nesto left Martha sitting alone in the conference room, surrounded by the beautiful flowers they'd arranged together, with tears streaming down her face and the full weight of her miscalculations settling around her like winter shadows. The legal document that had seemed so clever 6 months ago now felt like the instrument of destruction for the very relationships she'd hoped to nurture and protect. Sometimes the desire to fix what's broken can cause more damage than leaving things alone. To heal naturally, Martha had learned that lesson too late, and now 3 people who'd grown to care deeply about each other were scattered like leaves in a storm of her own making, wondering if anything they'd shared had been genuine or if it had all been just another performance in an elaborate drama she'd written without their knowledge or consent. 3 weeks passed in a silence that felt like winter settling into bones. Nesto completed his final flower deliveries to Caldwell Reed with professional courtesy, but no warmth, avoiding any contact beyond what was necessary to fulfill his contractual obligations. Matteo noticed the change immediately, the absence of Martha's cheerful presence during weekend deliveries, the disappearance of chess games and literary discussions that had become the highlight of his week. "Is Mrs. Caldwell sick?" Matteo asked. One evening, as they sat at their small kitchen table, the beautiful chess set packed away in its mahogany box, because neither of them could bear to look at it. "Not sick, exactly," Nesto replied, struggling to find words that would explain the situation without destroying his son's faith in human goodness. "Sometimes adult relationships get complicated in ways that are hard to understand. Did you have a fight?" "Something like that." Matteo studied his father's face with the sort of perceptive attention that made Nesto sometimes wish his son were less observant. "You miss her. And you miss Miss Caldwell Reed, too." The accuracy of Matteo's observation hit harder than Nesto had expected. He did miss them, missed Martha's stories and gentle wisdom, missed Celeste's gradually warming smile and the way she'd begun to relax in their company. But more than missing them, he felt the particular ache that comes from discovering that something precious wasn't what you thought it was. Sometimes missing someone isn't enough, Nesto said finally. Sometimes there are problems that can't be fixed just by wanting them to be fixed. Meanwhile, across the city in her penthouse office, Celeste was discovering that professional success provided little comfort when personal relationships lay in ruins. She'd thrown herself into work with renewed intensity, accepting every business trip and scheduling meetings that kept her occupied from dawn until well past dark. But in the quiet moments between phone calls and presentations, she found herself thinking about Saturday mornings, spent arranging flowers and conversations that had felt more genuine than any she'd experienced in years. Her assistant, Rebecca, had noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. "Should I continue to hold your Thursday afternoons open?" she asked during their weekly schedule review, referring to the time Celeste had been spending with Martha and Nesto. "No need," Celeste replied without looking up from her computer screen. "Those arrangements have been discontinued." Rebecca nodded without comment, but Celeste caught the concerned glance she exchanged with the office manager. Celeste's staff had grown accustomed to their boss's gradual softening over the past few months. The way she'd started asking about their families and remembering personal details that had previously fallen outside her sphere of interest. Her return to purely professional interactions had been noted and, apparently, regretted. The situation became more complicated when Martha began calling. At first, Celeste simply refused to take the calls, instructing Rebecca to say she was in meetings or traveling. But Martha's persistence was legendary, and eventually she began appearing at the office, forcing confrontations that Celeste couldn't avoid through mere scheduling. "You can't ignore me forever, dear," Martha said during one such ambush, settling into Celeste's office chair with the sort of determined dignity that had made her formidable in her own, right during Harold's business building years. "I'm not ignoring you. I'm protecting myself from further manipulation and punishing yourself in the process. You were happy, Celeste. For the first time since your father died, you were genuinely happy. Are you really willing to throw that away because of how it began? How it began matters. Trust matters. I can't build a relationship with someone who's been deceiving me from the start." Martha pulled a letter from her purse handwritten on school notebook paper in Mateo's careful script. "This arrived yesterday. I think you should read it." Celeste accepted the letter reluctantly, recognizing Mateo's neat handwriting from the homework assignments she'd seen during their evenings together. As she read, her professional composure began to crack. "Dear Mrs. Caldwell, I hope you're feeling better. Dad says you and Miss Caldwell Reed are having some grown-up problems that are hard to understand. But I wanted you to know that I don't care about any of that stuff. You're the first person besides my mom who ever made me feel like being smart was something special instead of something weird. You taught me chess and listened to my book reports and made me feel like my ideas mattered. I don't understand what happened between you and Dad and your daughter, but I know you have a good heart because you were kind to me when you didn't have to be. Mom always said that people's actions show who they really are, and your actions were always kind. I'm keeping the chess set safe and practicing the moves you taught me. Maybe someday when the grown-ups figure out their problems, we can play again. I miss you very much. Your friend Mateo, asterisk." Celeste finished reading and sat in silence for several minutes, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. When she finally looked up, Martha was watching her with eyes that held more sorrow than manipulation. "He doesn't know the details," Martha said quietly. "Nesto just told him that adult relationships sometimes get complicated. That boy is protecting me, even though I'm the reason his world has been turned upside down. Mother, what you did was wrong. However good your intentions were, you violated our trust in fundamental ways. Yes, I did. And I'm sorrier than you'll ever know." But Celeste, that letter, that beautiful, generous letter from a 13-year-old boy who has every reason to be angry with me, that's not the result of manipulation. That's the result of genuine connection Real affection, authentic relationship. Celeste reread portions of Mateo's letter, struck by the wisdom and emotional maturity it revealed. He's protecting you, just like he probably protects his father. From worry, just like he's been carrying adult burdens since his mother died. And you've been protecting yourself from emotional risk ever since your father died, Martha observed gently. Maybe it's time for all of us to stop protecting ourselves from the possibility of being hurt and start protecting the relationships that actually matter. That evening, Celeste found herself driving through the neighborhood where Nesto and Mateo lived, not quite ready to knock on their door, but unable to stay away entirely. She parked across from their building and watched the warm light glowing in their second-floor windows, imagining the quiet domestic scene inside homework at the kitchen table, simple dinner preparations, the sort of understated family intimacy she'd observed with unexpected longing during their time together. The decision to actually approach their apartment took another hour of internal debate. What would she say? How could she explain the difference between her mother's manipulation and her own genuine feelings? How could she convince them that her care for their well-being hadn't been calculated or strategic? When she finally climbed the narrow stairs to their floor, she could hear the murmur of conversation through the thin walls. Nesto helping Mateo with what sounded like a history project. The normality of it, the patient father-son dynamic that she'd come to treasure. During their evenings together, made her chest ache with loss. She knocked softly, and the conversation inside stopped. Footsteps approached the door, and she heard Nesto's voice asking who was there. "Celeste," she said simply. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she wondered if he would refuse to open the door. When it finally swung inward, Nesto's expression was carefully neutral, not hostile, but not welcoming either. "What do you want?" he asked. "To apologize. To explain. To ask if there's any way to salvage what we built together, even though it started with deception." From behind his father, Mateo appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up with surprise and pleasure. "Ms. Caldwell Reed, did you come to see the letter I wrote to your mom?" "I did see it," Celeste said, kneeling to meet Mateo at eye level. "It was one of the most beautiful letters I've ever read. Your mother would be very proud of the young man you're becoming." Mateo beamed, then looked uncertainly between his father and Celeste. "Are you going to be friends again?" "Dad's been really sad, even though he tries to hide it." Nesto's carefully maintained composure flickered at his son's observation. "Mateo, why don't you go finish your homework? Ms. Caldwell Reed and I need to talk." After Mateo reluctantly disappeared into the kitchen, Nesto stepped aside to let Celeste enter the small living room. She noticed immediately that the chess set was nowhere to be seen, and the absence felt like a physical representation of everything that had been damaged. "I need you to understand something," Celeste began, choosing her words carefully. "I had no knowledge of my mother's manipulation. The feelings I developed for you, the way I came to care about Mateo, the happiness I found in our time together, none of that was calculated or strategic." "How do I know that?" Nesto asked bluntly. "How do I know what was real and what was just you responding to your mother's orchestration? Because I'm here. Because I've spent 3 weeks missing you and Mateo more than I've missed anything in years. Because I've discovered that professional success feels completely hollow when you don't have people to share it with." Nesto studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. "Your mother hurt us, Celeste. She hurt my son, who trusted her completely. She made us feel like we mattered to her, when really we were just tools in her plan to fix your emotional life. I know, and I'm furious with her for that. But I'm also furious with myself for letting pride and hurt feelings destroy something that was making all of us happier. So what are you proposing? That we just pretend the last few weeks didn't happen? That we go back to the way things were and ignore the fact that our entire relationship was built on a lie?" Celeste was quiet. For a long moment, gathering courage for honesty that felt more vulnerable than any business negotiation she'd ever conducted. I'm proposing that we start over, not pretending the past didn't happen, but building something new on a foundation of complete honesty. I'm proposing that we give ourselves permission to care about each other without hidden agendas or family complications. And your mother? My mother will have to earn back our trust through her actions, not her apologies. But she's 83 years old, and she's genuinely sorry for what she did. I don't want to spend whatever time she has left punishing her for mistakes that came from love, even if that love was expressed in destructive ways. From the kitchen came the sound of Mateo's voice. Dad, are you going to invite her to stay? For dinner? We have enough spaghetti, and she looks hungry. The simple, generous offer from a boy who had every reason to feel betrayed by the adult complications surrounding him seemed to unlock something in the tension between them. Nesto's expression softened slightly, and Celeste felt tears threatening for the first time since the whole situation had exploded. He's been asking about you both, Nesto admitted. Every day. He doesn't understand why the adults can't fix their problems when he still cares about everyone involved. Maybe because children are smarter about love than adults are, Celeste suggested. Maybe they understand that caring about someone isn't diminished by finding out the circumstances weren't perfect. As if summoned by their conversation, Mateo appeared in the doorway again, this time carrying the mahogany chess set. I've been practicing the moves Mrs. Caldwell taught me. Want to see? The sight of the chess set, the catalyst for so many. Happy hours together sitting in Mateo's hands like an offering of peace proved more persuasive than any argument either adult could have made. Sometimes children understood intuitively what adults complicated through overanalysis, that love given freely was still love, regardless of the circumstances that had created the opportunity for it to flourish. As December's early darkness settled around their small apartment and the aroma of simple pasta filled the air, three people who had almost lost each other began the delicate work of rebuilding trust and rediscovering the connections that had made them all happier, stronger, and more complete than they'd been alone. Christmas Eve arrived with news that shattered their fragile reconciliation. Martha had collapsed at home and been rushed to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The call came to Celeste first, then she immediately contacted Nesto, their recent conversations, making it natural to reach out to him during a family crisis. Is she going to be okay? Nesto asked as they stood together in the hospital's waiting room, Mateo clutching the get-well card he'd insisted on making during their hurried drive downtown. They don't know yet. Her heart rhythm is irregular, and they're running tests to determine if she had a heart attack or if it's related to stress and exhaustion. Celeste's composed businesswoman facade had cracked completely, revealing the frightened daughter underneath. She's been so fragile since our argument. I think the guilt has been eating at her. Dr. Sarah Chun, the attending cardiologist, emerged from Martha's room with the sort of carefully neutral expression that medical professionals wore when delivering uncertain news. Are you Mrs. Caldwell's family? I'm her daughter, and these are close family friends, Celeste replied, instinctively including Nesto and Mateo in the family designation. Your mother has experienced what we call stress cardiomyopathy, sometimes known as broken heart syndrome. It's a temporary weakening of the heart muscle that can be triggered by intense emotional stress. The good news is that it's usually reversible, with proper treatment and rest. The bad news? Celeste asked because there was clearly more. At her age, any cardiac event is serious. She's stable now, but we want to monitor her overnight. The next 24 hours will tell us a lot about her recovery prospects. They took turns sitting with Martha, who drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring apologies that broke everyone's heart. During one of her more lucid moments, she gripped Nesto's hand with surprising strength. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I never meant to hurt you or Mateo. I just wanted my daughter to be happy. I know, Nesto replied, and meant it. Sitting beside her hospital bed, watching this elegant woman reduced to fragility, his anger had transformed into something closer to understanding. Rest now. We're all here. Together? Martha asked hopefully. Together, Celeste confirmed from the other side of the bed, taking her mother's other hand out. As evening settled over the hospital, they established an informal vigil. Celeste had convinced the nursing staff to allow Matteo to stay past normal. Visiting hours, explaining that Martha considered him a grandson. The boy sat in the corner chair, quietly reading aloud from one of the books Martha had given him, his voice providing a gentle soundtrack that seemed to ease her restless sleep. Around 10 o'clock, when the hospital halls had grown quiet and most visitors had gone home to their Christmas Eve celebrations, Nesto found himself alone with Celeste in the family waiting area. They sat in plastic chairs that had probably witnessed countless family crises, sharing coffee from the machine. That tasted like disappointment, but provided necessary caffeine. I keep thinking about what she said, Celeste admitted quietly, about wanting me to be happy. I didn't realize how unhappy I'd become until I started spending time with you and Matteo. Grief has a way of making people forget how to live, Nesto observed. After Carmen died, I went through the motions for months' work, taking care of Matteo, paying bills, but I wasn't really living. I was just surviving. When did that change? Nesto considered the question, tracing the timeline of his gradual emergence from the worst of his grief. Slowly and all at once. Little moments that added up to something bigger. Matteo laughing at something on television. A particularly beautiful sunrise over the lake. Your mother's smile when she talked about chess strategies. My mother's smile when she talked about you and Matteo, Celeste corrected gently. She hasn't been that animated about anything since Dad died. Whatever her methods were, she genuinely cares about your family. And I genuinely care about yours, Nesto replied, the words carrying weight that had nothing to do with Martha's. Manipulation and everything to do with the feelings that had developed naturally, despite the artificial circumstances of their introduction. Celeste turned to look at him directly, her expression vulnerable in a way he'd rarely seen during their business interactions. What are we doing, Nesto? Are we trying to rebuild a friendship? Or is this something more? The directness of the question deserved an equally direct answer. I don't know. All I know is that I've been miserable without you in my life, and not just because of the business arrangement. I miss talking to you. I miss the way you listen to Matteo's book reports, like they're the most important presentations you've ever heard. I miss watching you discover that you actually enjoy arranging flowers. I miss your laugh, Celeste said softly. And the way you make me feel like I'm interesting as a person rather than just as a business contact. I miss feeling like part of a family instead of just the person who manages family logistics. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from Martha's room, urgent voices and the sound of medical equipment being wheeled quickly down the hallway. They rushed back to find Martha fully awake and sitting up in bed, arguing with a nurse about discharge procedures. I'm feeling much better, and I want to go home. Martha was insisting with a sort of imperious tone that suggested her energy had returned along with her stubbornness. Mrs. Caldwell, you had a cardiac episode. Less than 12 hours ago. You need to stay for observation, the nurse replied with patient professionalism. It's Christmas Eve. I want to spend Christmas morning in my own house with my family. Martha's gaze swept over Celeste, Nesto, and Matteo with an expression that brooked no argument. All of my family. Dr. Chun arrived to mediate the standoff, ultimately agreeing to discharge Martha on Christmas morning if her overnight tests remained stable. But you'll need someone with you for the next few days. No driving, no strenuous activity, and immediate medical attention if you experience any chest pain or shortness of breath. I'll stay with her, Celeste said immediately. We all will, Matteo added, speaking up from his corner chair. It's Christmas. Families should be together on Christmas. The simple declaration from a 13-year-old boy seemed to settle something that the adults had been dancing around for weeks. Whatever complications had surrounded the beginning of their relationships, whatever mistakes had been made in the name of good intentions, they had indeed become a family of sorts, unconventional, perhaps, but bound by genuine affection and mutual care. That night, as they maintained their vigil in Martha's hospital room, Nesto found himself removing something from his wallet that he'd carried for 3 years. Carmen's engagement ring, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, had traveled with him as a talisman of love and commitment. But sitting in the quiet darkness, watching Celeste read softly to her mother while Matteo dozed in his chair, he realized that carrying the ring had become less about honoring Carmen's memory and more about protecting himself from the possibility of loving someone new. Carmen had always believed that love multiplied rather than divided, that caring for new people didn't diminish what you'd felt for those you'd lost. As he carefully tucked the ring into a different compartment of his wallet, Nesto felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of grief that made space for hope without dishonoring the past. When Celeste noticed him putting something away, she raised an eyebrow in quiet question. "Just making room," he said softly, and she seemed to understand that he was talking about more than physical space in his wallet. Sometimes the most profound changes happened in hospital waiting rooms at midnight on Christmas Eve, when the artificial boundaries between families dissolved and people discovered that love was indeed large enough to encompass everyone who was willing to give and receive it freely. Christmas morning dawned crisp and bright, with snow beginning to fall as they helped Martha from the wheelchair into Celeste's car. The hospital had released her with strict instructions and a list of medications, but her spirits had improved dramatically overnight. She sat in the passenger seat, wearing the burgundy dress she'd requested from home, insisting that Christmas required proper attire, regardless of recent cardiac episodes. "Where are we going first?" she asked as Celeste navigated the empty streets. Most of Chicago was home opening presents, but their little family had different priorities. "Your house," Celeste replied. "You need rest, and we need to make sure you have everything you need." "Actually," Nesto said from the back seat, where he sat beside Matteo, "I brought something for you, Mrs. Caldwell, a Christmas present that couldn't wait." From his jacket pocket, he produced a single white rose, perfect in its simplicity, clearly chosen with great care. "I stopped by the flower market early this morning. Thought you might like to have something beautiful to celebrate your recovery." Martha accepted the rose with tears in her eyes, holding it as carefully as if it were made of spun glass. "It's lovely. But you know what would make it even more beautiful? If we put it in water at my house and had Christmas breakfast together. All of us." The suggestion transformed what might have been a quiet recovery day into something approaching a celebration. At Martha's house, they worked together preparing a simple meal: scrambled eggs and toast, coffee that actually tasted good, and orange juice that Matteo insisted was essential for proper Christmas nutrition. Martha supervised from her favorite chair, the white rose in a crystal vase beside her, offering gentle directions and commentary that made the simple cooking feel festive. "Your father proposed to me on Christmas morning," she told Celeste as they set the table with her good china. "Right here in this dining room, 35 years ago. He'd hidden the ring in my coffee cup, which nearly gave me a heart attack. When I discovered it—" "I remember that story," Celeste said softly. "You used to tell it every Christmas when I was little. I stopped telling it after he died. Seemed too painful to remember happy times when I was struggling to get through each day. But this morning, with all of you here, it feels good to remember the joy instead of just the loss." As they sat around Martha's table, sharing breakfast and stories, the conversation naturally turned to the events that had brought them together and nearly torn them apart. Martha had insisted on addressing the elephant in the room, saying that Christmas was no time for avoiding difficult truths. "I owe you all an apology that's bigger than words can contain," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "What I did was wrong, even if my intentions were good. I manipulated people I care about because I was afraid of losing them, and in the process, I nearly lost them anyway." "Mom," Celeste started, but Martha held up a hand. "Let me finish. Dear, I've had all night to think about this." She turned to address Nesto and Matteo directly. "I hired investigators and orchestrated meetings because I was terrified that my daughter was becoming as isolated and bitter as I was. But what I should have done was trust that good people recognize each other naturally without elaborate schemes." "Mrs. Caldwell," Matteo said seriously, "my dad taught me that people make mistakes when they're scared or hurt. The important thing is whether they learn from those mistakes and try to do better." The wisdom in the boy's words, delivered with such matter-of-fact compassion, seemed to unlock something in the adults around the table. Here was a 13-year-old who had experienced loss and disappointment, but had somehow maintained his capacity for forgiveness and growth. "You're absolutely right," Martha said, reaching over to squeeze Matteo's hand. "And I promise to do better going forward. No more manipulation, no more schemes, just honest friendship, if you'll still have me." "Of course we'll still have you," Nesto replied. "Family doesn't give up on family, even when family makes spectacular mistakes." The word family hung in the air between them, acknowledging what they'd all been feeling, but hadn't quite dared to name. They were family now, not through blood or marriage or legal documents, but through choice and affection and shared experiences that had created bonds stronger than their individual histories. "Speaking of family," Celeste said, pulling a small, wrapped box from her purse, "I have something for Matteo. I hope it's appropriate." Matteo unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a first-edition copy of Great Expectations in pristine condition. His eyes widened as he opened the cover and discovered an inscription in Dickens's own handwriting. "Miss Caldwell Reed, this is too expensive," he protested, though he held the book as if it were a sacred object. "It's not too expensive if it brings joy to someone who appreciates literature the way you do. Besides, books are meant to be read and treasured, not locked away in collections." The gift was perfect in its understanding of what would truly matter to Matteo. Not something flashy or expensive for its own sake, but something that honored his intellectual curiosity and love of reading. It was the sort of present that someone gave when they truly saw and valued the recipient. As they finished breakfast and moved to the living room, where Martha's Christmas tree stood decorated with ornaments that represented decades of family celebrations, Nesto found himself watching Celeste with new appreciation. The careful businesswoman who had first approached his flower stall had evolved into someone warmer, more spontaneous, more willing to take emotional risks. "I have something for you, too," he said, pulling a small package from his jacket pocket. Celeste unwrapped it to discover a delicate silver bracelet, simple in design but clearly chosen with thoughtfulness. "Nesto, it's beautiful, but I didn't get you anything." "You gave me something much more valuable than a present," he replied. "You gave me and Matteo a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than just the two of us. You gave us family." Martha, who had been watching these exchanges with obvious pleasure, clapped her hands together. "Well, if we're being honest about gifts, I have an announcement to make." She pulled a legal document from the end table beside her chair, clearly prepared in advance. "Despite the spontaneous nature of their Christmas gathering, I've had my will revised again. This time, there are no conditions, no tests, no requirements for proving emotional development. My estate will be divided equally between Celeste and a trust fund for Matteo's education, with provisions for supporting Nesto's business expansion if he chooses." "Mother, you don't need to," Celeste began. "I want to, but more importantly, I want you all to know that this has nothing to do with earning inheritances or meeting expectations. This is simply what family does. We take care of each other. As snow continued to fall outside the windows and the warmth of Martha's house enveloped them like an embrace, four people who had found each other through a combination of chance, manipulation, and genuine affection settled into the comfortable rhythm of a family Christmas. They played chess and read aloud from Matteo's new book, shared stories and laughter, and gradually began to understand that sometimes the most meaningful gifts were the ones that couldn't be wrapped or purchased. The white rose Nesto had brought that morning sat in its crystal vase throughout the day, a simple symbol of new beginnings and the sort of love that flourished when people chose to see the best in each other despite their imperfections. By evening, when they were all reluctant to end their time together, it had become clear that Christmas morning had marked not just Martha's recovery, but the official beginning of their chosen family, one built on honesty, forgiveness, and the radical decision to love without guarantees or conditions. 6 months later, the warm May sunshine streaming through the windows of the new flower shop felt like a benediction. The space was modest, but perfectly appointed, twice the size of Nesto's old Union Station stall, with proper refrigeration, units, a design workspace, and a small seating area where customers could linger over coffee and conversation. The sign outside read, "Alvarez and Associates Family Flowers," in elegant script, a name that had emerged naturally from their partnership and reflected the collaborative spirit that had made the expansion possible. Celeste had insisted on being a silent partner, providing the capital for the lease and equipment while allowing Nesto to maintain creative and operational control. It was a business arrangement that worked because it was built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than the artificial dynamics that had characterized their early interactions. The spring wedding arrangements are our biggest success so far, Nesto told Martha as they worked together preparing centerpieces for a Saturday ceremony. Apparently, brides are willing to pay premium prices for flowers that come with personal attention and custom design. Martha, who had recovered completely from her Christmas Eve cardiac event, and now served as the shop's unofficial customer relations specialist, smiled as she adjusted a particularly stubborn peony. It's because you listen to what people actually want instead of trying to sell them what's most profitable. There's a difference between customer service and customer care. The distinction was one Martha had taught him during the early weeks of planning the shop expansion. Her years of watching Harold build his business had given her insights into the importance of relationship building and long-term thinking that complemented Nesto's natural empathy and artistic sensibility. Matteo, now 14 and even more serious about his academic pursuits, spent most afternoons at the shop doing homework and helping with simple tasks. The arrangement gave him spending money for books and provided Nesto with the comfort of knowing his son was safe and supervised during the after-school hours. More importantly, it continued the mentoring relationship with Martha that had become one of the most important influences in the boy's intellectual development. Northwestern sent another recruitment letter, Matteo announced as he entered the shop that afternoon, waving an envelope with the university's distinctive letterhead. They want me to attend their summer program for gifted students. That's wonderful news, Martha said, beaming with pride, though not particularly surprising. You've been ready for college-level work since you were 12. The educational opportunities that had seemed impossible just a year ago were now within reach, thanks partly to Martha's trust fund, but mostly to Matteo's own exceptional abilities and dedication. The scholarship offers had begun arriving in March, and every week seemed to bring new possibilities for his future. Are you nervous about starting high school in the fall? Celeste asked as she arrived for their weekly family dinner planning session. The tradition had evolved naturally from their Christmas reconciliation Sunday dinners that rotated between Martha's house, Celeste's condo, and the small apartment above the flower shop that Nesto and Matteo now called home. A little, Matteo, admitted, but mostly excited. My English teacher says I can probably test out of freshman literature and move directly into advanced placement classes. As they talked about Matteo's academic plans and the shop's summer wedding bookings, Nesto found himself marveling at how natural their family dynamic had become. Celeste had learned to relax her need for control, allowing conversations to meander, and plans to evolve organically. Martha had channeled her organizational energy into legitimate mentoring rather than manipulation, and he had discovered that accepting help from people who genuinely cared about his family's well-being wasn't charity. It was simply what families did for each other. "I have news too," Celeste announced as they prepared to close the shop for the day. "The board approved my request for extended sabbatical. I'm taking 6 months off starting in July." 6 months? Nesto paused in his flower trimming, surprised by the length of time. "What will you do with that much time away from work?" "Learn to paint. Travel somewhere that doesn't require business meetings. Spend time with the people I care about without scheduling it around quarterly reports." Celeste's smile carried a lightness that had been absent during their early interactions. Maybe help a certain flower shop owner expand into event planning services. The suggestion of deeper business partnership was intriguing, but more important was what it represented: Celeste's willingness to prioritize relationships over professional advancement, to choose presence over productivity in a way that would have seemed impossible during their first meetings. "We should celebrate," Martha declared. "All of these wonderful developments deserve a proper celebration." "What did you have in mind?" Nesto asked, though Martha's celebrations had a tendency to be more elaborate than anything he would have planned himself. "A garden party? Next weekend? At my house. Nothing formal, just an excuse for our friends to meet each other, and for us to acknowledge how much our lives have changed." The party, when it happened, was everything Martha had envisioned and more. The guest list included Matteo's teachers, several regular flower shop customers, who had become genuine friends, Celeste's assistant Rebecca and her family, and even Mrs. Chun from the wholesale flower market, who had been Nesto's first business mentor. It was the sort of gathering that created new connections, while celebrating existing ones. As the afternoon wound down and guests began to leave, Nesto found himself standing with Celeste in Martha's garden, watching Matteo demonstrate chess strategies to a group of younger children, while Martha supervised with obvious delight. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if your mother hadn't orchestrated our meeting?" Celeste asked. "Sometimes. But I think we would have found each other eventually. Good people have a way of recognizing each other, even without elaborate schemes." "I hope you're right. Though I have to admit, I'm grateful for her interference, even if her methods were questionable." Nesto turned to study Celeste's profile as she watched their chosen family interact with easy affection. "Are you happy? Really happy? Not just content or successful?" "Happier than I've been since Dad died. Happier than I thought was possible after losing him." She paused, then added with characteristic directness, "Are you?" "I am. Carmen would be amazed by how our lives have expanded. She always believed that love multiplied instead of divided, and I think she'd approve of the family we've built." As if summoned by their conversation, Matteo appeared beside them, still glowing with the excitement of teaching chess to eager students. "Mrs. Caldwell wants to know if you're ready for dessert. She made that chocolate cake you like, Dad." "In a minute," Nesto replied, but he was watching Celeste's face as she observed the easy interaction between father and son, the way they included her naturally in their dynamic, without making her feel like an outsider. "Actually," Celeste said, "I have one more announcement. I've been thinking about this for weeks, and today seems like the perfect time." She pulled a small velvet box from her purse, but instead of the engagement ring Nesto might have expected, it contained a delicate gold locket. "It was my grandmother's," she explained, opening it to reveal tiny photographs of Harold and Martha from their wedding day. "I want Matteo to have it. as a reminder that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to love and support each other. Matteo accepted the locket with the same careful reverence he'd shown for the chess set in the first edition Dickens, understanding intuitively that he was being entrusted with something precious. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'll take good care of it." As they walked back toward the house together, Nesto reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a struggling single father running a modest flower stall, worried about making rent and saving for his son's education. Now he was part of a thriving business partnership, a member of a chosen family that provided both emotional support and practical assistance, and most surprisingly, someone who had learned to accept love without questioning whether he deserved it. The flower shop's success had exceeded all their expectations, but more important was the sense of purpose and connection it had created. They were building something together that was larger than the sum of its parts, a business that served their community, a family that transcended traditional boundaries, and a future that held possibilities none of them could have imagined. When they were navigating their separate struggles alone, as Martha's laughter drifted from the kitchen, where she was serving cake and telling stories to the remaining guests, Nesto understood that sometimes the most profound transformations began with the smallest gestures: a helping hand offered to a stranger, a flower chosen with care, a child's letter written from the heart. These simple acts of kindness had the power to create ripple effects that changed multiple lives in ways that none of the participants could have predicted. The sign outside their flower shop, Alvarez and Associates Family Flowers, represented more than a business name. It was a testament to the radical idea that families could be chosen as well as inherited, that love could multiply across boundaries of age and background and circumstance, and that sometimes the most beautiful arrangements emerged from the most unexpected combinations of elements. Standing in Martha's garden on that perfect May evening, surrounded by the sound of conversation and laughter from people who had become integral to their happiness, Nesto felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The white roses Martha had planted in memory of Harold bloomed along the garden fence, their simple beauty a reminder that some gifts, like love, like family, like the willingness to help a stranger find their way, continued to flourish long. After their initial planting, as the sun set over, Chicago and their chosen family gathered around Martha's dining room table for cake and stories. Nesto realized that the most important lesson he'd learned wasn't about flowers or business or even about love. It was about the courage to remain open to unexpected connections, to trust that kindness offered freely would find its way back in forms more beautiful than anything he could have planned or orchestrated. The future stretched ahead of them, full of Matteo's academic achievements and Celeste's sabbatical adventures and Martha's continued recovery and the flower shop's steady growth. But more than any specific milestone, what mattered was the knowledge that they would face whatever came next together, as a family that had chosen each other deliberately and loved each other completely, imperfections and all. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories began with the most ordinary moments: a helping hand offered at a train station, a flower chosen with care, a conversation shared between strangers who discovered they weren't strangers after all. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those small beginnings blossomed into something larger and more lasting than anyone had dared to dream possible.